Hey folks, we are back with a review that's nearly 6 years in the making, or the waiting of at least, since I'm going to be talking about the review copy I received of Homebear Studios' Nairi Rising Tide, a sequel to 2018's Nairi Tower of Shirin. Like its predecessor, Rising Tide is a narrative-heavy point-and-click adventure, but it does add a few things to the mix mechanically that adds more complexity to the experience as a whole. But was this an experience worth seeing, or did I find the experience to be a wash? Boo! I'm your host Arlian, let's find out together. Now, on the story front of things, Nairi Rising Tide picks up shortly after the ending of its predecessor, being a direct continuation of the narrative, so it might be to your benefit to go check out my review of that video first to see if you want to give this one a whirl. That said, for those folks who are still here, I'll do my best to sum things up in such a way as to avoid major spoilers. So, story-wise, our protagonist is Nairi, who was separated from her family and is now desperately seeking to find and rejoin them. There's just one small problem. Her parents were council members caught up in a conspiracy meant to usurp the existing power structure. Suffice to say, if she wants to make any headway in her goal, she needs to find allies she can trust, and leads on figuring out those who are responsible for her misfortune. That, and figure out how to navigate the city itself, given she found herself in the poor quarters. Complicated as that is, it's hardly even the sum of her situation either, because Nairi's problems aren't just limited to the present. She's a messenger, an individual tied to the mysterious origins of the city of Shirin, and perhaps the only person that might be able to interpret the ruins of the past in order to avoid it playing out in the future. It's a lot to take in, to the point that Rising Tide has the courtesy of providing players a more in-depth version of what I just did with an optional summary of the events of the prior game, which covers everything that I've glossed over and omitted. And honestly, it's sort of necessary if you haven't played its predecessor, because the Nairi series as a whole is very story-focused, and this latter edition, despite being narratively dense, doesn't waste a lot of time backtracking or revisiting earlier moments in exposition. It will assume that you are caught up. And having said that, there is still just a lot going on, and it's more than happy to take the time to further flesh things out and expand on it, especially with its cast. And it's that latter element that I'm really appreciative of, because I'm quite fond of the characters as a whole. The central cast is likable in general, and fairly charming given the writing leans more towards the light-hearted side of things. Except when it doesn't. Things get a bit bad here and there, because, well, Rising Tide, the overarching story that at least to her, begins to direct things in a grimmer direction. Not necessarily in an overpowering or morbid sense, but one that's noticeable compared to the bulk of its story and its predecessor, a trend I see continuing in the next title as well. Which, yes, while Rising Tide does build up to a fairly dramatic and fitting conclusion and answers a number of questions which were brought up in its predecessor, it doesn't resolve the central issues of the story, and in fact introduces some new story elements which bring a certain gravity to the entirety of the experience. I just hope it won't take another 6 years to see the story's conclusion. Anyways, that's been a lot, and I still haven't even gotten to the gameplay, so let's kick things off. Now, as far as a point-and-click adventure goes, the core elements are all there, tasking players with clicking around its various screens to solve puzzles, and collecting items, which are then in turn used for other puzzles. Basic stuff really, though a bit kinder than many of its peers, since Nairi has the courtesy of highlighting items that you can collect or interact with. A simple feature which goes a long way towards averting pixel hunting as long as you're willing to give each room a cursory glance. In fact, the only exception to this rule is when you need to show or give an item to an NPC, but even then, those instances are fairly obvious. Oh, and speaking of basic, Rising Tide also adds some item crafting, but these are largely just puzzles hinging on collecting objects and then arranging them in a small menu. So, largely just some fiddly bits that I may have flubbed early on during an introductory puzzle because my brain failed to process that I needed to put something in the tool slot. Yeah, that was my bad. All of which is to say, by and large, that the difficulty of the game generally feels pretty reasonable for the bulk of the experience. And then you get to the 2 puzzle-dense regions, and things escalate. Rather than strictly hinging on the more tried-and-true basics of the point-and-click genre, these are chock full of more involved conundrums to pore over, which can vary in complexity from figuring out the correct combination of switches to pull to more comprehensive conundrums like setting up a tower-spanning pipeline network, which also entails setting up secondary routes you can make your way through said tower. In fact, both of these areas are so involved and expansive, with such a sharp uptick in difficulty, that there's actually an in-game option to skip past these segments so you can get back to the story. I just wasn't willing to do so, partly because I was enjoying the challenge, but also because there were nuggets of story lodged away in both these segments, such as bits of background lore, and even some nifty bits of foreshadowing lodged in the environments themselves. Still, the less difficulty-inclined members of the audience can take a fair bit of relief in the fact that the hint system does exist. While it's not immediately accessible, it does crop up fairly early on, providing players with pictographic hints which unfurl slowly so as to nudge players in the right direction without completely spoiling the solutions, unless used repeatedly. Only there's a little bit of a weird stipulation attached to it. Remember that thing I said about there being no pixel hunting? Well, to use hints you need to spend gold, which can only be acquired by searching screens for innocuously placed gold coins in purses, or recruiting people to a certain rebellion. While they aren't the worst thing to hunt down, it's extremely easy to overlook a number of them if you aren't carefully scrutinizing each screen, or if things that are small just sort of blend in for you. What's more, if you're a collectible hunter, you'll also be measuring out whether you'll want to be spending them on hints or buying character sculptures, which provide small blurbs on the characters they're modeled after and count towards an achievement. Realistically, if you scour the game, you'll have more than enough to buy all of them and still have an ample amount left over for hints, but it's still something you should be mindful of. Especially since there are coins lodged in those tricky puzzle areas you can skip, and both of those also serve as points of no return, though the game is kind enough to warn you on that front. And speaking of kindness, there's a fair bit of convenience built into the experience, given the game is pretty happy to provide you with a fast travel option, so you can bounce around the map a lot more efficiently, which helps you know where a puzzle is that you have the solution for, but you don't want to click through all the rooms to get there. You know, except for the super involved puzzle areas, no dice insofar as getting around smoothly there. But yeah, that's by and large the gameplay elements, beyond the fact there's some collectible art pieces scattered throughout the game, if you're inclined to hunt around for them. And speaking of art, I really do have to give it up for Nairi. There is something absolutely charming about its aesthetic. I've said that about its predecessor, and I cannot help but say it about this one as well. I found it absolutely lovely, and especially its character designs, which are just cute. There's a lot of love poured into the character portrait, which really helped to bring Nairi and her companions to life and even make the NPCs you meet all the more memorable. It also really serves to reinforce how much of a goblin Nairi is. I also cannot understate just how lovely some of the environments are, and again, the details which show up as background elements, which can really add some oomph to things when the implications of them sink in. There's a lot of foreshadowing if you keep your eyes open, it's just good. I also happen to be rather fond of the OST as well. Its tracks are well suited to the scenes across the board and made things a lot more memorable and distinct as I was passing through things. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is this was a treat to play. Nairi Rising Tide does a phenomenal job of building on its predecessor, both in regards to its mechanics, as well as the manner in which its narrative continues to develop. While the game is largely lighthearted, I never found any of its humor grating, even if I wanted to punt a certain philandering penguin out a window. As far as the main cast went, I was invested throughout the entire experience, and I was satisfied by the developments in the central plotline. Hell, as much as the climax left me feeling a bit antsy, it still feels earned because of how it ties the story together and how much everything was advanced. And I will appreciate that the game didn't feel the need to constantly exposit things that already occurred or to constantly replay everything that happened in the prior game. It more or less took into account that someone who got here probably played the last game and knows where things are going and just trusts us to be following along, and not having endless rehashes made me very happy. So yeah, by dint of that, and by virtue of its puzzles, which run the gamut of simple to fiendishly engaging, I'd be remiss to call this anything but a very solid hit, and one which leaves me extremely eager to play the next part of the series, and maybe potentially pick the brains of the developers in the interim. If you guys want to see an interview, feel free to leave a comment on this video and maybe questions you might have for them about either Nairi Tower of Shirin or Rising Tide, or just where the series is going to be going at large. If I get enough questions and I can figure out enough of my own, I'll see about reaching out to them and what they feel like doing. P.S. In case you have a terrible memory like me, this game's actually pretty forgiving to people who play games in small bursts, since there's a feature that lets you review earlier story scenes in your journal, which helps insofar as brushing up on what you were doing and other plot points without relying on constant exposition. It's just a nice feature, just like that whole little summary feature on the front page. The game's well made. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, leave a comment. If you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit subscribe and the bell. For a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron, check the description. And check out my Patreon to see reviews early and support the channel, like Green Witch Babby and Andy Noted. Also, I have a merch house with neat swag like Crit Hit coffee mugs and shirts. With all that said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.